What if the last place you ever felt safe was the place that ended your life? At 8:42 p.m., a phone rang in Wisconsin, a mother calling her son. It rang once, twice, 5 times, no answer. She didn't panic, not yet. Adults miss calls all the time. But by midnight, something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet, gnawing feeling in her chest. By morning, his phone went straight to voicemail. By the second day, his truck would be found, abandoned. And by the end of that week, investigators would realize that Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. had not simply disappeared. He had walked into something, and he never walked back out. Rosalio wasn't the type to vanish. He had routine, he had responsibility, he had family who heard from him regularly. He wasn't unstable. He wasn't running from debts. He wasn't in trouble. He was consistent, predictable, safe. And safe people don't just evaporate. When his truck was discovered, there were no signs of a crash, no struggle in the parking lot, no emergency. It was just there, as if someone had placed it carefully, as if someone wanted it found. And that's when investigators started asking the question that would unravel everything. Who was the last person to see him alive? To understand why this case unsettled detectives so quickly, you have to understand who Rosalio was. He wasn't living recklessly, he wasn't spiraling, he wasn't isolated. He worked, he checked in with family, he had friends, he showed up when he said he would. There were no signs he planned to leave town, no packed bags, no drained bank accounts, no goodbye messages. If anything, he seemed hopeful, because recently there had been someone new in his life, a woman, a relationship that had moved fast. And when relationships move fast, emotions follow just as quickly. At first, everything seemed exciting, constant communication, late nights, inside jokes, plans being made almost immediately. But intensity can blur red flags. Friends would later say he seemed distracted, less available, harder to reach. There were subtle changes in his tone when he talked about her, moments of hesitation, brushed off comments about arguments. Nothing extreme, nothing that screamed danger. But sometimes danger doesn't scream, sometimes it whispers. The romance escalated quickly, text messages all day, calls at night, arguments that burned hot and ended just as fast. Neighbors would later report raised voices, tension, emotional volatility, but from the outside, it looked like passion, and passion is easy to excuse. There were signs of jealousy, questions about who he was with, comments about who he spoke to, small attempts at control that often get disguised as affection. Why didn't you answer? Who were you texting? Why are you always busy? Individually, they seem minor. Together, they form a pattern. And then came the night he was last seen. Rosalio drove to her residence. Alive, witnesses confirm he went inside. There are no confirmed sightings of him leaving, no surveillance showing him walking away, no digital trail proving he went anywhere else, just a door that closed behind him, and silence. When questioned, she said they argued. She said he left upset, but something in her timeline didn't align. And when detectives began comparing her statements to phone data, movement patterns, and then surveillance footage, the story started cracking. Because this wasn't starting to look like a breakup, it was starting to look like containment. And the deeper investigators looked into that relationship, the clearer it became. Rosalio didn't disappear into thin air. He disappeared into someone's secret. When detectives first sat across from her, the room was quiet. Too quiet. She didn't appear frantic. She didn't seem confused. She didn't ask the kinds of desperate questions you'd expect from someone whose partner had just vanished. She said they argued. She said he left angry. She said she didn't know where he went. But her timeline, it was too polished, too rehearsed. Investigators have a saying, when someone is telling the truth, their memory is messy. Real memories have gaps, pauses, imperfections. Her version didn't. She described the argument in detail, what was said, how he reacted, what time it happened. But when asked what happened after he supposedly walked out, her certainty faded. Security cameras in the surrounding area showed no clear footage of Rosalio leaving on foot. Phone records told another story. His phone stopped moving shortly after arriving at her residence. Hers, however, did not. It pinged in places her statement didn't explain. And then came something subtle, but damning. Detectives noticed signs of cleanup inside the residence. Not dramatic, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, just small disturbances. Areas recently wiped down. Carpet sections that appeared treated. Trash bags disposed of outside normal pickup schedules. It wasn't chaos, it was controlled, and control suggests awareness. By now, investigators were no longer treating this as a missing person case. They were working a homicide. They just needed proof. In modern investigations, phones tell stories people try to hide. Deleted messages were recovered. Fragments of conversations hinted at escalating tension in the days leading up to Rosalio's disappearance. There were arguments about loyalty, about trust, about who he had been speaking to. Search history revealed something chilling. Queries related to cleaning techniques, questions about how long certain forensic evidence lasts, location searches outside her normal travel patterns. Individually, each search might be explainable. Together, they painted something darker. And then there was the timing. Some of those searches occurred before Rosalio was officially reported missing, before anyone knew there was reason to panic, which raised one terrifying possibility: someone already knew something had happened. Investigators mapped out movement data. Her phone left the residence during a window of time when she claimed she never left. It traveled briefly to a remote area. It returned. That trip alone shifted the case from suspicious to alarming. Because if Rosalio had stormed off like she claimed, why was her phone moving in secret hours later? Why the detour? Why the gap? When confronted with this data, her demeanor shifted slightly. A pause, a swallow, then an attempt to reframe the timeline. Small changes, adjustments. But the cracks were widening, and detectives knew people don't adjust the truth unless they're trying to outrun it. Interrogations are psychological battles. It's not about shouting, it's about pressure. When asked directly whether she harmed Rosalio, her response wasn't outrage. It wasn't grief. It was calculation. She asked what evidence they had. She asked what they thought happened. She mirrored questions instead of answering them. That's when investigators leaned into silence. Silence forces people to fill space. And in that space, contradictions grow. Her breathing remained steady, her posture controlled. But subtle tells began to surface. A tightening of the jaw, a slight delay before certain answers. Overly specific details about irrelevant parts of the evening. When people fabricate, they often overcompensate in areas that don't matter, and underexplain the ones that do. Detectives presented the phone data. They mentioned surveillance gaps. They hinted at forensic findings without revealing specifics. That's when her confidence faltered, not dramatically, just enough. Her version of events shifted again. Now the argument was more intense. Now he didn't just leave, he ran off. Now she might have stepped outside briefly. The story was evolving, and evolving stories rarely point to innocence. Behind the scenes, forensic analysis continued. Biological traces were being processed, vehicles examined, digital backups restored. And with each new piece of evidence, the window of plausible deniability shrank. This was no longer about whether something happened. It was about when the breaking point occurred. Was it sudden rage, an impulsive act after an argument spiraled? Or was this building quietly for weeks? Jealousy tightening into control, control tightening into violence. Investigators were certain of one thing: Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. did not walk away from that house alive. The only remaining question was whether she would admit it, or whether the evidence would speak for her. By the time investigators reached this stage, the case had shifted from suspicion to structure. They weren't guessing anymore. They were building. Digital forensics teams reconstructed timelines down to the minute. Phone pings were layered over surveillance footage. Vehicle movement was mapped against cell tower data. Deleted content was restored piece by piece. And the picture that formed was not accidental. It was intentional. Her phone leaving the residence during a narrow window of time. Her device traveling toward a remote area. Her return shortly after. The route wasn't random. It was purposeful. Meanwhile, forensic testing inside the home began yielding results. Traces that had been wiped still left microscopic signatures. Cleaning agents don't erase everything. They disturb. They dilute. But they rarely eliminate. Investigators began to believe that whatever happened inside that house was violent and fast. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of a third party. Everything pointed inward. When detectives confronted her again, they didn't accuse. They didn't shout. They laid out the timeline calmly. The argument. The silence. The phone movement. The cleanup. And then they waited. The human brain under pressure does one of two things. It doubles down, or it fractures. Her responses became shorter, less certain. She no longer corrected investigators confidently. She no longer filled silence with detail. Instead, she began asking what would happen next. And that question alone told detectives everything. Because innocent people ask where their loved one is. They don't ask what comes next for them. By this point, law enforcement was no longer looking for a missing man. They were building a murder case. The arrest came quietly. No dramatic chase. Just a warrant signed after weeks of methodical evidence gathering. When authorities took her into custody, the community froze. Neighbors who had seen them together struggled to reconcile the image. The couple that seemed intense, but normal, passionate, but ordinary. Family members of Rosalio were left with something worse than uncertainty. They were left with confirmation. The formal charges outlined a grim theory that an argument escalated, that violence occurred inside the residence, that steps were taken afterward to conceal what happened. At the bond hearing, details emerged that had been withheld, statements that indicated the confrontation was not minor. Jealousy, control, emotional volatility. The courtroom was silent, because when romance turns deadly, the betrayal feels heavier. Friends replayed conversations. Family remembered red flags. And the haunting realization settled in. Sometimes the danger isn't obvious. Sometimes it looks like love. Even after the arrest, one question lingered. Why? Was it fear of abandonment? A need for control? An argument that crossed an irreversible line? Or was something darker already present beneath the surface? True crime isn't just about evidence. It's about patterns. And this case forces us to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths. Violence in relationships rarely begins with violence. It begins with control, with jealousy framed as passion, with isolation disguised as closeness, with intensity mistaken for devotion. By the time the escalation becomes visible, it may already be too late. For Rosalio Gutierrez Jr., that escalation ended in silence. A silence that his family will carry for the rest of their lives. A silence that began the moment he walked into a house he believed was safe. And that silence echoes far beyond Wisconsin. Because this case isn't just about one relationship. It's about recognizing warning signs before they turn fatal. It's about listening when something feels off. It's about asking hard questions, even when love makes them uncomfortable. And now I want to ask you something. At what point do red flags stop being relationship problems and start being danger? Was this a crime of sudden rage, or a slow-burning storm that everyone underestimated? If you were sitting on that jury, what would your verdict be? Let me know in the comments. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit like so this story reaches more people. These conversations matter. Awareness matters. Subscribe if you want more psychological true crime breakdowns, cases that go beyond headlines and into patterns. And if this story taught you anything, share it. Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and prevention is understanding the warning signs before it's too late. Justice may move through courts, but awareness moves through people. And stories like this remind us why we have to keep telling them.